Laughter echoed through the charity auction hall when the notoriously haughty heiress, Vanessa Calloway, gestured mockingly toward a rusted, dust-covered vehicle abandoned in a dark corner of the garage. "You want a parting gift," she taunted, "then take my father's pile of junk." The crowd erupted into mean-spirited chuckles, yet Daniel Hayes, a financially struggling single father who made ends meet by restoring antique machinery, merely stepped up and accepted the keys in absolute silence. A mere 2 weeks later, the American financial landscape would be rocked to its foundation. That corroded automobile wasn't scrap metal. It was an elusive prototype that automotive collectors had spent 4 decades trying to track down. Its actual worth, $9 million. At 42 years old, Daniel Hayes hadn't always been just a grease monkey in a forgotten neighborhood. Not long ago, he was a highly sought-after mechanical engineer. He possessed the kind of intellect that sparked bidding wars among tech corporations. A man who could decipher a complex blueprint as effortlessly as reading the morning news, finding absolute clarity in measurements that looked like gibberish to the untrained eye. He had graduated near the top of his cohort and spent 10 years building a stellar career, engineering systems that eventually became textbook material. But tragedy struck 3 years prior. A relentless illness claimed his wife, Sarah, outpacing every medical specialist they consulted. After agonizing months of sitting by her hospital bed long after visiting hours ended, watching life support breathe for the woman he adored while their young daughter waited at home, something inside Daniel broke. He lost all ambition for the life he had built. Walking away from his lucrative salary and a luxurious Riverview apartment, he retreated to a modest rental house with his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. It was a place where the porch light constantly flickered and the scent of motor oil lingered in the drywall. He transitioned to restoring classic cars in a leased garage on the outskirts of the city, a job that paid in cash and quiet appreciation. It kept his hands occupied and his grieving mind sufficiently numb to survive the day. His new routine was simple: pick Lily up at exactly 3:15 p.m., cook modest dinners to stretch his budget, and read her the same familiar bedtime stories she knew by heart. In his past life, industry elites sought his counsel and shook his hand at galas. Now he was virtually invisible, and most days Daniel convinced himself he preferred the anonymity, finding peace in not having to perform success for an audience. The city had orchestrated a massive estate sale for the recently deceased billionaire, Richard Calloway. Richard's legacy was stamped across the city's skyline on hospital wings, scholarships, and corporate plaques. Hosted at the family's sprawling, manicured estate on the city's edge, the event was dripping with imported marble floors and an intimidating aura of wealth that made ordinary people instinctively whisper. His 36-year-old daughter, Vanessa, had inherited not only his vast empire, but also a chilling emotional detachment that made her a staple in coastal gossip columns. She was infamous for her tardiness to her own fundraisers, for treating service workers like inanimate furniture, and for deploying a calculated, icy smile reserved strictly for photographers rather than genuine human connection. Daniel only attended because a buddy suggested there might be a few interesting vintage engines among the estate's lots. He harbored no illusions of fitting in among the tailored tuxedos and champagne flutes that cost more than his monthly rent. Wearing a clean but visibly threadbare jacket, he navigated the periphery of the gala with the practiced stealth of a man used to being overlooked. To the affluent guests drifting past, he was indistinguishable from the building's maintenance crew. He ignored their superficial chatter about stock portfolios and vacation homes, preferring the silent, logical language of metal and mechanics. Strolling past the open garage bays, far from the clinking crystal and roaring conversations, Daniel spotted something concealed beneath a heavy canvas tarp in a poorly lit alcove. The rest of the garage was packed with pristine, cataloged classic cars, each polished to a showroom finish and boasting a placard of its history. This lone vehicle, however, sat segregated and unlisted, pushed into the dark as if someone had deliberately forgotten it. Only a tiny fraction of its frame peeked out. While anyone else would have walked past assuming it was junkyard fodder, Daniel's eyes, honed by decades of studying forgotten mechanical history, locked onto that exposed sliver. The curvature, the exact proportions, it triggered a memory of a shape he had studied in obscure automotive journals during late-night research sessions. His pulse gave a familiar jump, a phantom flutter of the excitement he used to feel when chasing an unsolvable engineering puzzle in his youth. Kneeling quietly to avoid disturbing the tarp, he analyzed the exposed curve for several minutes, mentally cross-referencing it against schematics he hadn't thought about in years. Though he tried to dismiss it as a desperate imagination seeking a thrill in a mundane life, the dormant engineer within him wouldn't let it go. He stood up, ensured no one was watching, and headed back to the main hall, his mind entirely consumed by that hidden chassis. Later, near the dessert spread, Daniel made the error of voicing his thoughts to an audience that couldn't care less. He casually suggested to a small group that the dust-smothered car in the garage might be worth preserving, nodding that forgotten machines often hide valuable histories. Vanessa Calloway overheard the unfamiliar voice expressing genuine intrigue over what she considered her father's eccentric clutter. A cruel, amused smirk spread across her face. Setting her drink down with dramatic flair, she turned to him. "You actually like that thing," she projected, ensuring the surrounding socialites heard the dripping mockery in her tone. A wave of condescending laughter rippled through the elite crowd, the kind of laughter the wealthy reserve for an easy target. A nearby executive, sporting a watch that dwarfed Daniel's yearly earnings, chuckled that it was just rotting scrap metal, assuming it was a joke Richard had forgotten about. The room nodded in agreement, reveling in the effortless cruelty unique to rooms full of immense privilege, indifferent to how the insult landed on the man standing before them. Daniel felt the oppressive weight of their gaze, the familiar sting of being reduced to a punchline by people who never worried about their next paycheck. Yet, he remained silent, absorbing the ridicule with the stoic patience he had developed over years of swallowing his pride for the sake of peace. Vanessa, irritated by his composure and fueled by a wicked impulse, decided to make him the main act of the night. She marched over to a key drawer by the garage entrance, grabbed a tarnished brass ring holding the keys to uncatalogued vehicles, and abruptly chucked them at Daniel's chest. "My father held on to that thing his entire life for no reason anyone could ever explain," she announced loudly over the party's din. "If you want it so badly, consider it a gift, my parting gift to the help." The ensuing laughter was even sharper, designed to make a man feel small. But Daniel didn't wince. Closing his fist around the keys, he met her gaze with a profound calmness that disturbed her far more than any angry retort would have. "Thank you," he stated simply. He offered no defense, no justification for his interest, and no fodder for their amusement. With steady strides, he turned and exited the gala, utterly unbothered. His absolute refusal to be shamed grated on Vanessa. She found herself staring at the empty doorway, plagued by a lingering discomfort that she hadn't quite won the exchange, a thought she couldn't shake for the rest of the evening. It took Daniel and a friend's borrowed flatbed truck the majority of the next morning to transport the vehicle. The tires were rotted flat, and the engine was entirely seized from decades of neglect. Despite his friend's repeated questioning about why he was wasting time on a rusted pile of junk, Daniel just shrugged, saying he wanted to evaluate it closer. Once parked under his shop's fluorescent bulbs, surrounded by the comforting scent of grease and steel, Daniel meticulously inspected it. He ran his palms over dented fenders, knotting curves that felt far too intentional for a mass-produced model. The anomalies piled up rapidly. The chassis number didn't align with any known manufacturer databases. Underhood components appeared precision-machined by hand, rather than factory-assembled. The faded grille badge had been deliberately swapped to mask the car's true origins. Driven by mounting suspicion, Daniel spent the night hunched over his kitchen table after Lily was asleep. He dug out his archived technical journals and vintage catalogs, frantically cross-referencing grainy black and white photos and engineering notes until his eyes burned. Just before midnight, his hands began to tremble. The fender's unique curves matched an experimental prototype that had completely vanished from historical records decades ago, an automotive holy grail that historians and collectors had relentlessly sought without success. If he was right, the vehicle's worth was astronomically beyond his wildest comprehension. However, Daniel was a man grounded in engineering discipline. He refused to let blind hope supersede hard evidence. He initiated a painstaking, methodical restoration, treating the vehicle like a crime scene. Every bolt was documented, every serial number photographed, building a case piece by careful piece. Weeks passed in disciplined routine. Then, a breakthrough occurred almost by accident. While removing the original driver's seat to check the underlying frame for structural rust, his fingers snagged on an irregular seam in the upholstery. Carefully slicing the thread with a thin blade, making sure not to ruin the worn leather, he uncovered a custom-built concealed compartment in the seat's base, a modification no factory would have made. Inside, wrapped in protective oilcloth to fend off decades of moisture, lay a weathered leather notebook, a stack of curling photographs, and several meticulously folded letters. The handwriting on the yellowed envelopes was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the business world. The distinct, slanted script of Richard Calloway. Sitting on the chilly concrete floor, Daniel paused, the unopened journal in his lap. He realized he had stumbled upon an intimate family secret rather than a mere collector's curiosity. For a moment, guilt washed over him, wondering if some histories were meant to stay buried forever. Reading through the night, Daniel's understanding of the car and the late billionaire was completely overturned. Richard hadn't just bought this car at an auction. The early entries revealed he had spent 30 years quietly protecting it. He moved it between storage units under aliases and paid mechanics strict hush money to keep it barely functional, never fully restoring it. He had rejected life-changing offers to sell, prioritizing the car's monumental secret over any financial gain. According to the increasingly frantic notes, Richard believed the vehicle held a secret tied to a pivotal moment in automotive history. As the night stretched on, a haunting question gnawed at Daniel. Why would a highly public billionaire, a man who documented his whole life for the press, hide this from everyone, even his own daughter? Thinking of his own daughter, Lily, sleeping down the hall, the parallel between fatherhood and unspoken legacies deeply unsettled him. Knowing his own localized expertise wasn't enough to verify a discovery of this magnitude, Daniel meticulously compiled his evidence. He photographed every custom part from multiple angles, built a coherent timeline, and began emailing renowned vintage automotive historians late into the night. Initially, the replies were polite but dismissive. Veteran experts had dealt with countless eager amateurs convinced they'd found a missing treasure, only to be let down. After the fourth rejection, exhaustion and grief nearly convinced Daniel to abandon the pursuit, making him question if he was just desperately manufacturing significance in a life that had been stagnant for far too long. But then, a professor specializing in 20th century automotive engineering,